So today we're talking about movement variability and a bunch of other fitness jargon that relates to movement variability. And we'll even get into Bill's least favorite words. Yeah, that's fine. So about 20% of you aren't subscribed to the podcast yet, so please remember to do that. Like, comment, subscribe. Commenting helps us greatly. Share this podcast and on YouTube with your friends if you feel like they'll enjoy it, and then leave us a comment if you can think of other things you want to talk about. Thanks. I sufficiently feel like I sold my soul enough.
Welcome to Reconsider. I'm Bill Hartman. This is the podcast to challenge you to ask better questions, to look beyond traditional models of thinking and arrive at better health and fitness solutions.
So the things that we had initially listed were cardio and anaerobic training was one of them.
Okay, that's reasonable.
And then we had why your outcomes won't stick.
Ouchie.
And then functional training, which is, yeah.
That's the F word.
Core training.
I'll have to look in the anatomy books for that one. I'm not really sure what that.
Movement-based approaches.
Aren't all approaches movement-based?
Yeah, unless you're dead.
What kind of crap is that?
The approach that has you ice cold in a coffin 6 feet under. That's not movement based anymore.
Oh my gosh. This can be useful. Jargon can be useful. It cuts to the chase. It saves time until it's not useful, because then it becomes meaningless. And that, like, the more something gets used, the further away from its original meaning it is. And then it just becomes a bunch of like catchphrases and things so people can sound a certain way. That's not helpful.
Yeah. Well, it allows people to have it's the illusion of a shared language, because everyone in the room starts talking about mobility training or core training, and 5 of the people are thinking of different things, but they're all agreeing upon different things at the same time. And then it's just a big mess.
It's very strange. It is very. Yeah.
Because it's like, you and I think the core training is important, but we actually consider core training completely different, a completely different thing.
I don't even consider it. How about that?
Well, there you go. Yeah, but the thing is, if someone says that to you and brings it up to you, unless you're going to correct them right away, you're going to know where they're coming from, right?
Well, I just ask questions.
Yeah.
Right. So that's how for anybody. So I have people that come to see me from all over the place, and they will use dirty words all the time. I don't pass judgment on them, because I kind of know where it's coming from. Right. They've just read enough things and they hear the same words repeated. So they start to repeat the same words because they want to appear to understand, or they want to feel that they understand themselves. Right. They want to be comfortable with it. And so they think that I use that terminology, therefore they will use that terminology with me. And the reality is, it's like, I just got to keep asking them questions until I figure out what they understand or what they think they understand.
Yeah.
Right. And then you can have the clarifying conversation. Until then, who knows what it means?
Right. Because it's the whole thing about the jargon is there isn't any sort of standard to it. It's not like a language that has pretty set rules, but people treat it as such. So it's like if you go to visit France or something like that, and you want to use the French that you learned, and you go into like a coffee shop, you can like kind of get your way through it, but at the end you're kind of annoying them.
All I can do, Chris, is I can get to the library.
Yeah.
That's the only phrase that I can remember from 2 years of French.
French? Yeah.
Je voudrais étudier à la bibliothèque. Right? It's like, I would like to study.
¿Dónde está la biblioteca? That's Spanish.
I would like to study at the library. I think that's what I said. Not really sure.
Anyone that knows French can
Well,
leave
I
a
had a
comment.
French mentee. I had a French mentee for a while, and
Well, there you
she
go.
would help me a little bit with my French.
Well, let's run with this jargon thing.
Okay.
Let's try to list your naughty words for people to
Oh,
actually see. You
ugh.
can remember off the top of
I
your
can't
head.
remember off the top of my head, but if you bring them up, I can tell you if it's in
Well,
there.
for sure, one of them
Well,
is
you got the
functional.
C word, the M word, and the F word, like right off the bat. Like those are yeah.
So
Um,
what is it?
and people think that they know what the dirty words are now, but we got to do I have to say them out loud because it makes me a little sick to my stomach.
And we can throw up a list. Yeah, you can just, yeah. I mean, we should kind of, because we've referenced it, and people certainly know that, the word functional is a triggering word for you.
Yes.
But it's, the functional and, well, I can't remember all of them anymore.
See if this resonates with you. You want to get back to the gym and get in shape. Maybe get back to playing golf or your favorite sport, or get out and go for a run. Maybe you just want to move and feel better. But every time you restart, that old ache or strain rears its ugly head and interrupts your comeback. When I wrote All Gain No Pain for my patients who had completed their physical therapy, we knew what they were ready for. You're in a different space with a different starting point than before. You don't feel like a physical therapy patient, so you're going to need to approach this differently. With some guidance, you'll first need to reconstruct your movement foundation that takes your physical structure into consideration. You're going to have ongoing questions as you think differently, so you're going to need a like-minded, supportive community to support your progression. If you're ready to begin your reconstruction, we have a new group starting soon.
There's core, there's neutral, there's dysfunction, tissue quality. Did I say I said neutral, right?
Yeah, you said neutral already. Yeah.
Okay. I'm old. I literally forgot that I had already said neutral.
Well, you're trying to like mentally disassociate from having to say them out loud.
See, I just stay away from the use because they've just become unnecessary and not helpful. Because again,
Right.
they could either mean a million things to a lot of people or they mean nothing. And again, we want to use terminology that's helpful, right? That has some consistency in it in its meaning versus like, okay, if you first of all movement has intention. Whether you know it or not, there is an intention associated with it. Therefore, it doesn't require any qualifier. It is just movement, right? To say something is functional or non-functional is not helpful because it is a movement. What we need to understand is what was the intention? How is that useful? And versus branding something as again, it's a qualifier that doesn't help. It doesn't mean anything. Therefore, I don't like it. It doesn't move us forward in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem comes from like that last part you're talking about when it's not useful and it doesn't help, when it's not moving anything forward, and it's sort of just there for the sake of like the words. So
Right.
you have people, even if we don't like a certain word, or we think it's like silly, or we're tired of how it's being used, if everyone that's in the conversation understands it from that context, it might be the best word to use. But if it's just confusing for all the people involved, and it's not going to give you the outcome that you're looking for, or it's going to take you longer to get to the outcome you're looking for, then it's really not going to be useful. It's like tremendous amount of information on Google about their, glute amnesia, or their glutes are asleep, or their glutes are off.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why they have back pain, is because they need better glute activation. And they're going to find a lot of articles to support this. And they're going to find a lot of people that do these things and have all of these like stories about how their back pain went away once they just started doing hip bridges and stuff like that. But it's like, then those people use that terminology going forward for everything else. And that's where it sort of becomes confusing.
Well, then they become defaults as solutions. And that's typically not the case, because what you end up seeing is you rarely see the alternative represented, where, oh, I did all that stuff and I got worse. Because that's what I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
That's what I see clinically. I see that. I don't see the people that okay, because there are situations where maybe driving more external rotation through the system provides a symptomatic relief.
Yeah.
And there are also situations where that will magnify the problem, and thus is the this issue with what is presented, because rarely do people show the failures. So again, we just have to be a little bit more particular in how we would present these things, right? I like having a meaning for it. I would hazard to guess that people would brand something as a dysfunctional movement. It's just a movement that was the undesired effect. But from the system's perspective, it was solving the problem in the best way possible under that circumstance.
Right.
So that maybe they didn't have an alternative, and therefore it wasn't the desired outcome, but it was the only one that could be arrived at under the situation. Right? But that doesn't make it dysfunctional. It just means that that was the one solution that they had. Right? You can't use the same solution under every circumstance. That tends to be problematic. That's a lot of reasons why people do run into difficulty. It's not that it's dysfunctional. It just means that the one that you have available isn't the right one. You need more options. We establish more options, we tend to have more favorable outcomes.
Right. Yeah, and it's the principle that every organic system works under is it'll try to find the path of least resistance. And in a lot of cases, given the constraints of the system, that path of least resistance, if it's the same every single time, there's going to come some point of failure from doing it that way.
Right.
Instead of having like these, I don't know, we're getting into the jargon territory again, but when people talked about like movement variability or adaptability, it's like you being able to get to the same outcome of variety of different ways using similar patterns and behaviors, but not the exact same patterns or behaviors.
Right.
Because that's
this is one, like movement variability as a representation that's an accurate term, as long as you understand how we arrive at that, which means that there's a consistency of outcome through various means. So, for instance, a baseball pitcher, a very high level, highly skilled baseball pitcher, will have a release point for a pitch that is relatively consistent, even though there may be small adjustments. So think about every pitch, the shape of the mound that they're pitching off of is different. It's a different shape because they drag dirt this way and that way. They're walking on it, they're stepping on it. So there's always different starting conditions, but they're adaptable enough. They have enough variation. They have enough options available so that they can be consistent with their release point. For normal human beings, imagine getting in your car in the dark. So you're in a dark parking lot. You drop your keys on the floorboard of the car. You pick them up, and you immediately land into the ignition. Right? It's not a place that you would typically bring your keys from into the ignition, but your brain knows where the ignition is, and so it solves the problem rather amazingly well. And you will land almost instantly in the ignition of the car. It's one of those really cool things about being human, right? It's playing a musical instrument is along the same lines, where there's just these infinitely small variations in your ability to access movements and positions that end with a resultant that is consistently accurate. It's just really cool to read about that. This is Nikolai Bernstein's like repetition without repetition, right? It's the statement that's being exactly saying you can never reproduce. Here you go. um, um, good posture is on the kind of dirty words list. It's like if there was such a thing as a good posture, you could never perform it twice. Like as a human being, the way our movement capabilities work is like you can't reproduce the exact same movement. We can do things that look very much alike, but they are never exactly the same. So again, we can't be chasing one singular ideal. What we want to do is we want to have options available to us that allow us to achieve a consistency in behavior, but rather than an exactness, not chasing the one, but chasing the many. So because if you have the many, you have all. And if you have all, then you have no limitations in your capabilities within whatever the constraints of the system should allow.
Right.
Right.
So it
So
provides
we
you
get rid of
having, creating the potential to then proceed towards your outcome through a variety of ways.
Right. That's
It's
what
like
the variability would mean.
Yeah.
Right? So it can be useful. It can be useful, but if you're just saying, "Oh, we need to just like reestablish movement variability," that's kind of vague, right?
Right. Or if the strategies that you're using to move are just a bunch of crappy outside of your base of support movement behaviors, it's just going to add more, as what they would say in the jargon world is you're adding strength to dysfunction.
I don't know what that means.
Exactly. So like what I think they mean is that you're taking a strategy that's put you in a position of pain, and you're just continuing to do it and adding load to it in the hopes that that will somehow get you past the point of failure by strengthening
The
that.
concern under that circumstance would be a reinforcement that narrows the capabilities into a movement or position that would be less desirable based on the outcome.
Right.
Okay.
Because you're not getting there in an efficient, and I guess not even just from an efficiency standpoint, but from just the point of like repeatability. So if you have an outcome that you need to frequently attain, the cost of doing the actions needed to get to the outcome need to not like outweigh your ability to progress or do it again.
I think we went there for the jargon.
Well, then
We stayed for the concern over what it actually means and how valuable it is.
right. Well, I mean, it's an important topic, and I don't think we've talked about things that are relevant to movement variability, but I don't think we've specifically sort of dug into like what it is, what there even is to reconsider. Because are we asking people to reconsider just using jargon? Maybe we're asking people to try to get a better understanding of what that jargon even means, instead of just
Like I don't want to deter people from using jargon, because like I said, jargon is purposeful and useful when it's effective. It's just to pick on industry standards. It's very easy to enter certain industries. It's very easy to pick up on some of the jargon without having any depth of understanding of what it initially meant, where it was initially potentially useful. But then it just becomes something that loses its meaning because the people that are using it don't understand why they're saying it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's
it's getting tossed around.
I think that's the big problem.
Yeah, so it's like when you're trying to create a filter for yourself, it's kind of comes back to the whole concept of learning to ask better questions. And it's when you're looking for the intent of whatever you're talking about. So in the fitness world, in the health, performance, and fitness world, those are the outcomes you're seeking that have to do something with performance or health or fitness. So when you're talking about these things, those are always going to be the intentions of that thing. that you're talking about, but you have to kind of ask like, well, what is the intent of this specific thing? So like we're talking about like glute activation. And if it's just like, well, the intent of glute activation is to activate the glutes, that's not a completed concept.
Right.
But that's where people are. Like they're like, oh well, this is the people that talk
Because it's
when they
good
talk
for
about
you.
they
Because-
talk about the
Yeah.
the royal they, like oh well, they say that it's important to activate your glutes. And that might be the very surface level understanding that anyone has of a certain thing. And then that's what they end up using when they get into a conversation about anything in that health, performance, and fitness world with anyone
Yeah.
else. They're just like, oh, well, like, do you activate your glutes?
Yes. Well, we all know that is the solution for knee pain, right?
Yeah, well, it's the solution for a lot of different things depending on where you look.
Right. It's like, oh, you have weak glutes. It's like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
You can't activate your glutes. Yes, you can. Right. It's all a matter of
when a muscle is inactive, you're dead. You have some type of neurological.
And it would certainly be incapable, right?
Yeah, you can have
Again,
that.
those are just positions of and context, right? That
Right.
determine what behavior would be available under the circumstance, and you're just trying to impact that, right? But that's again that just becomes more of the reductionist viewpoint too, and that becomes interference. Right?
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, why having a structural reductionist perspective is not typically the best way to solve a problem.
It's not the best way to solve a problem, but it's the easiest way for people to try to understand something and feel some measure of certainty. Because then you can blame something, right? And if you can blame something, there's a solution. That feels good, right? Because if you say, oh, you have weak glutes, make glutes stronger, problem solved. But that's that's the unfortunate thing, is it's not the reality, right? That's where we run into problems. And again, that becomes very, for lack of a better term, jargony, right? It's like, okay, then it becomes, oh, you need glute activation. Oh, you need to strengthen your glutes. It's like it always becomes this thing, right? As if there's a part of you that works separately from everything else at any time.
Right.
Not really possible.
Yeah, and I find myself talking about this a lot in these podcasts, but that like looking past what might be actually happening, or trying to figure out what might actually be happening when someone's doing something, that whole like counterfactual idea is something that I think has been very useful for me, and I think would be very useful for many people to try to use when it's like, well, if they are saying that glute activation fixes ankle, knee, hip, lower back, hip flexor issues, just like magically doing glute exercises, what is it about these exercises that everyone's doing that's making these things better? Like that's the level of questioning that doesn't exist for a lot of people. They just hear something is good and then they want to try that thing, and it either works and they start singing the praises of doing lateral band walks, or they think it's stupid, they give up on it, and they try to jump on the next jargony bandwagon.
Right.
So then all of a sudden,
this goes back to continuing to evolve your understanding, learning more, gaining more perspectives. It's like, why can you and I have this conversation? Like if this was our first year in the industry, we wouldn't have this conversation. We would say, what glute activity do you do that works the best for your clients? That would be the conversation that we're having, versus saying like, okay, we really don't want to look at this from the reductionist viewpoint. We want to look at this from a much broader scope. We want to say, well, what are the influences? How would this activity be more effective under the circumstances? What are the secondary consequences? That's the conversation that you and I can have. Right. Whereas, again, somebody that just got their 30-day certification, looks good in a tank top, and then just starts working with people, and they're doing the same exercises that they took off the internet from someone else's blog, so they can put it in their blog.
Yeah. Right. Or they're literally just giving people the program that they do for themselves, and I'm
Well,
thinking
that's
like, well, this works for me.
Yeah, that's usually how people start. Is that whatever I did must be effective because I liked it and I look the way that I wanted to look, or I had an outcome that I wanted to have. So that must be good for everyone. Now the hope
Well, yeah,
is
yeah,
the hope is that you evolve from that. Like
that's a huge problem in the just the personal training and fitness industry in general is that
yeah,
people
but that's why the mentorship model is so important
right.
in all of these types of industries.
Yeah, and unfortunately on the consumer end, they're going to have to experience some failures with seeking out the trainers that just look the part, right?
Yeah, but like if you look the part and you're a really nice person and then you understand a little bit about sales and marketing, you probably do pretty well.
Yeah, I mean,
You probably would lose a fair number of clients, but you're going to gain a fair number of clients as well, right? And then you treat somebody nicely and they appreciate that. And that's a big part of the service business. Now, that's way off topic, but
right. Well, this kind of what this episode is sort of doing, right?
is this a
Kind
potpourri?
of,
Potpourri.
kind of running all over the place. Well, it becomes it's a difficult thing for me at the end because I have to figure out like what to call this. Because we initially started just going over all of the topics that I had written down early on, and it was
We just make a
full of a
list,
bunch of
right?
full of a bunch of jargon.
Short topics. We could just do short topics.
Yeah, I mean we're going over like the bad. So what have we talked? We've talked about dysfunction. We've talked about movement based approaches. We've talked about
Variability.
movement variability. Like what that actually means. I guess what we're doing is we're taking all these sort of jargony things and we're trying to boil it down to what people actually mean when they're saying it and what they're trying to talk about. Because like Bill's saying again, it's not that like we're saying that we're above using these words or that anyone that uses these words are stupid or something like that. It's just you can communicate in a way that's a little more, I guess, objective when it comes to this stuff, and it based on like intentions and outcomes.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be if the end goal of having these conversations and talking using these words is to achieve a certain outcome, everyone should try to get there in as few steps as possible and with as little secondary consequences and negative consequences as possible. And in order to do that, there can't be a certain level of confusion when talking about it, because there's too many mistakes that will be made in the preliminary period because of just of communication breakdown.
Right.
Yeah. So what are the other so neutral? We could talk about what neutral means. A fixed point in space where everything is neutral.
Okay. So let's use something that we mentioned before to eliminate neutral spine as a remote possibility. Okay.
Yeah.
So if let's just say Nikolai Bernstein is correct. Okay. Repetition without repetition can't reproduce the same position, can't reproduce the same movement more than once, right? Which would imply that, okay, having to chase an ideal. So neutral spine is supposed to be this one safe place or this one ideal place or this one place that is somehow represented as and somehow we can do this visually consistently, which I find even more difficult. So let's just say that there is a place that is this place. Chances are you might be able to do it once in your entire lifetime, and then everything else becomes a variation of. Right? So it's not about chasing a place. It's about having the options available, right? So that the displacement from it's like signal versus noise. It's about reducing the noise in a movement to produce consistencies in behavior. That's the goal. But calling something, again, calling it neutral spine, neutral to what? Under what circumstance? In what context? Right? We know that what is optimal for any variety of activities is different. It's not one. Right? Trying to use one representation again across the board means that you have actually reduced your adaptability. We want to be able to absorb insults, right? Maintain some measure actually of instability to be able to absorb these things, and then resume whatever said activity or position or activity we were attempting before, within whatever the necessary ranges for safety, health, etc.
Yeah, I think when people talk about a neutral position, I think what they mean and what they're trying to get, I mean, it's not very useful, because if you try to squeeze anyone into one representation that is the complete opposite of what like Bill is saying, and I'm repeating, it's the complete opposite of the variability perspective. You're choosing one way
Right.
to try to do everything. But it does those representations of stacked joint segments and everything. It's sort of the middle of the propulsive spectrum,
Right.
right? So it's that, people are standing with their feet symmetrical, their arms by their side, their heads on top of their ribs, on top of their hips, on top of their heels, and they're in a neutral position. That's really just being able to find the middle of this propulsive, early, middle, late propulsive
But it's
phase.
never the same.
Right.
The only sameness is that the application would be perpendicular to the contact on the earth, right?
Yeah. So it's
That would be
it's
consistent.
middle propulsion, trying to find the dead center of your center of mass within your base of support. Like that's something that people should figure out a way to be able to access. But it's not where you need to live and where you need to move for everything. You don't need to like keep neutral.
Well, there is no
spines.
movement.
Right. So you're giving yourself this sort of stiff representation, and then you're trying to hold that while you do everything. So then you're like,
Right.
you're
But you
brushing your
can't-
teeth and spitting in the sink with a neutral spine, and yeah, just like wild
Really,
stuff like
you're
that.
just trying to stay non-painful in that situation. When you get to be my
Right,
age,
you're just bracing and guarding.
yeah, brushing your teeth is a chore sometimes, because it doesn't feel good. No, it's instead of having the one, the goal is the many, right? I want to be able to change. I want to be adaptable, because very rarely, because we can't reproduce things perfectly, we have to have, there has to be noise in the signal, but you just don't want this broad variation. That's what we're actually talking about. So calling it a something is just, again, it's just not necessary. It's like the goal is the adaptability. It's much easier. It's much easier to apply force to the ground, or force to an implement, right? When you have the options available. It's when you don't, that becomes the problem, because then you have to use like a compensation that will produce stress and load and tension in an undesirable manner.
Yeah, you're using a bunch of external influences from like your muscles in this conscious efforts to squeeze yourself into this perfect position.
Right. Which you can't achieve.
Yeah, and if you try to continue to achieve it, you're actually going to be in the way of your ease of movement.
How do you even know when you're there?
Yeah.
Right. That's the thing. It's like, oh, I try to set up a good posture. How do you know when it's good? Like, at what moment is it good? You don't know. Make sure you can move. Make sure you can move well.
Yeah. My typical representation for people, honestly, is when you breathe, where does the air go?
Well, can it go in different places?
Yeah, it's like I usually give people the women, I usually give the analogy of like wearing a sports bra and trying to breathe into all aspects of the sports bra, or men if they have experience wearing like a heart rate monitor or something like that. Because if you're breathing in your neck and your shoulders and just in your chest, you know that you're not really in the center of your base of support.
Well, variation on a thing, right? You
Yeah.
gotta be able to move it. Just got to be able to move it around, right?
Yeah,
You
it
don't-
should always feel like this sort of like pendulum swinging that always goes through it. You pass through this magical neutral centralized position, but it isn't somewhere that you can live. Like I think that's the confusing part for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah,
always going to be like you were saying.
You can't,
Some,
you're not going to land on it. You're not going to stay in it.
yeah, you're just going to get, and you're going to get like you're going to approximate it. You might, like you
you're gonna
said,
get
you
there
might get
plenty
it
of different.
once.
Yeah. Like I said, you'll get, yeah, maybe you'll get there once in a lifetime. Who knows?
Yeah, and then
But you'll never know.
all the other times it's just a matter of like getting close to that.
Right. Yeah. Nobody can, it would be really weird, I think, to be able to do the exact same thing twice.
Right. So I guess maybe we can expand on this a little bit more, just the whole variability thing, because we keep touching back on it, so we might as well just like talk about it more.
Okay.
I think.
Sure.
I think one of the because I think when you and I talk, people get lost because we're obviously people are not in our heads, and the more time you and I spend together, we just end up sounding like the same person, so it's not really helpful. It's just like it's Bill and Chris just talking about the same shit again. I'll have to bleep that out. Keep cheap for the kids.
That's the lead in.
Bill and Chris talking about the same old stuff. But yeah, so when you lose movement variability, that's when you typically have people that are going to see Bill or I that have some type of recurring injury. They have some type of like tension or pain with certain movements, and they hit a point where they need to seek outside help for it. So those people we're saying have lost this variability.
There's much less, there's fewer options, there's much less change, right?
Right.
It's the lack of change ability. The way I always describe it to folks is if I make you sit on a hard chair for 5 hours and I don't let you move, eventually your butt's going to start to hurt. Why does it hurt? Because it's broken? Because it's damaged? Because your glutes aren't working? No, it's just because you're putting too much pressure in one place for too long a period of time. Your sensation recognizes that, sends a message to your brain. Your brain says, hey, I noticed that there's a lack of blood flow in a certain area. The cellular environment is starting to change in a negative way. I need you to move. And then you go like that, you fidget, and then you're fine, right? Because you're changing the position. It's like that's kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. So then if that's the consequence, that's a negative consequence of not having a multitude of options and having variability. How do we reverse engineer that? How do we like walk that back? If someone's gotten to the point where their multiple layers of compensation and stiffness has robbed them of their options,
Right.
how do we introduce these options or kind of dial back their path to stiffness?
So this is where reverse engineering comes into play, right? And then so reverse engineering is just working backwards from where they are. So at one point in time, they had a point A. That's where they started. Where they represent themselves now is point B. What we have to do is understand where point B is. And then we can understand based on the constraints of the system, which is structure, behaviors, what the potential options are under the circumstance, what behaviors that they use. So it's a multifactorial influence under the circumstance, but we can sort of construct what point B looks like based on physical structure. Like I said, we have a general representation of where they would have started, and then we understand the tendencies of those structures. And so we actually just work backwards in time from where they are and progressively restore the capabilities based on how their capabilities were eliminated or reduced based on, again, structure, behaviors, etc. If you can establish more options as to how, right? And so somebody walks in with pain on the inside of their knee, right? And if you can identify the strategy that they use in certain circumstances, And if you can change that strategy in any way, shape, or form, so there's many ways to do it. That if you look, through all different variations of manual therapies, there's different ways that you can wiggle this, move that, push on that, activities that allow a different position to arise at the knee under that circumstance. They can get a symptomatic relief. There's no question about that, right? People will get better in spite of what you do, right? You can actually do something that might be considered the wrong thing, would have a good outcome associated with that, right? What it comes down to the most, first and foremost, is the ability to change. There are better ways in my mind to do that, but there are certainly many that can end up with a desired outcome. If the desired outcome is I just don't want it to hurt anymore, right? Symptomatic relief counts, right? It doesn't mean that you've given them the best options under the circumstance, but it is a better option in regards to the pain response.
About having worked with people in the past, and I was able to help them with a different movement strategy, but maybe one that down the road would just lead to another issue.
The way I always compare that is like if you go to a golf instructor, to help you with your golf swing, and they identify a swing fault, and then they give you another swing fault that solves that problem, but creates a second potential other limitation. It doesn't mean it's going to be a problem. It just means that there's another restriction or limitation in the process, but it eliminated the reasoning or the reason that you were there in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So that becomes a point of confusion for a lot of people too. And that's going to involve that counterfactual line of thinking as well, is that, yes, we got rid of, if your intention was to get rid of your right hip pain in your backswing of your golf swing, and then I get you to just like do a left side bend and try to keep more weight on your left foot as you go through the swing. I can maybe eliminate the right hip pain, but I've just added another layer of compensation in order to,
right, yeah. This goes back to the conversation that we had. It was like it's a solution versus a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
We might see it as a solution, but we rob Peter to pay Paul, kind of a thing. It's like, okay, we eliminated the negative consequence that you identified. I gave you another strategy, which may not be, again, the best choice from a long-term perspective, but it solves the problem acutely. That might be sufficient for a lot of people. Yeah, that's fine.
Let's talk about that thought to wrap up here, because it's been a little all over the place. So if you're listening still,
I thought this was a completely coherent conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we're filming these now, I just think I'm having this thought in the back of my mind, like, this episode sucks. But then, like, that's what I thought about the bench press episode, and it was one of the most, like, well, just because we talked about bench press, I think.
Well, yeah, everybody wants to.
But yeah, so that idea of, there's a point in a lot of people's careers when they work in a field like ours or in some type of consulting where they just want to be like the solutions person.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more important to think about it from the perspective of trade-off management.
Yeah.
And like how those things are different. A solution is just like usually falls under the guise of like one size fits all. Everyone needs to do this particular thing. This is going to fix this. It's this sort of like direct, definitive, one-to-one relationship. And managing trade-offs there's just a variety of things going on. If you do one thing, you understand that there are three other things that are going to happen as a result. And then what are those three other things going to do in a feedback sense or even a feed forward sense to whatever you're trying to affect?
Well, we're always dealing with limitations on resources, and then the constraints of the system, the constraints of the environment. And so that's why it's always a trade-off. There is always going to be something that we would have to give up. Just think about anything favorable. It's like, if I want to lose weight, okay, I have to give up. Like, there's a trade-off. It's like, if I want to lose weight, get healthier that way, the trade-off is you don't get to eat as much. Like that's like a simple way to look at this.
Yeah.
If I want to go to the gym and I want to make bigger muscles, okay, I have to give up time. I have to tolerate discomfort. I have to then alter behaviors that are favorable in the um, mechanism to allow me to acquire more muscle, which means that I might have to give up social life. I might have to sleep more. Again, there's always things, but again, a lot of these things we're willing to sacrifice to get the return on investment. Doesn't make it a solution. Just means that we gave up something to gain something in return, and that's typically what's going to happen under every circumstance.
Yeah. And it's having the knowledge and the experience of applying these different strategies and understanding the trade-offs that exist because of based on the starting point.
Yeah. It does come with experience. It comes. That's why experience is so valuable. It's like, okay, we've been through this before. We kind of have an understanding of most likely, because we're always playing probabilities here, most likely what will happen under the circumstance. The greater your experience, the easier it is for you to manage those probabilities. It doesn't mean you won't have a bad outcome. It doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. It just means that you're less likely to do so. But again, that there's the value in time, developing filtering systems, gaining perspectives outside of where your current perspective is, and then, like I said, applying it repeatedly over time.
Reconsider is sponsored by Substance Nutrition. Go to substancenutrition.com. Get your Neuro Coffee, better brain, and Synthesis, better protein, better body. Enter the coupon code RECON, RECON, and get free shipping on all of your orders.